Have you ever heard your own voice speaking when you know for certain your mouth was closed? What if I told you that the most sophisticated spiritual predators don't attack through shadows or nightmares? They attack through something far more disturbing, your own identity. Tonight, I'm revealing the true story of Bryce, a 32-year-old software architect from Portland who discovered something was using his voice while he slept. But here's what will change everything you know about spiritual warfare. His family heard it too. And when entities can mimic you perfectly enough to fool the people who know you best, you're facing a strategic invasion most people never survive with their sanity intact. If you're exploring spirituality or meditation, the most powerful domination tactic in history has been hidden in plain sight for thousands of years, and it starts with stealing your voice. Most people don't understand that spiritual predators study you before they strike. They watch, they learn, they wait for the perfect moment when your defenses are at their lowest. Bryce was the kind of person who prided himself on rationality. MIT graduate, six-figure salary, the type who debugged code at 2 a.m. and considered pattern recognition his superpower, which is precisely why what happened to him was so strategically perfect, because entities don't just attack your weaknesses, they weaponize your strengths against you. It started on a Tuesday night in February, Portland rain hammering the windows. Bryce had just finished a 14-hour coding marathon, his mind still buzzing with algorithms and logic trees. He collapsed into bed around 1:30 a.m., his girlfriend Maya already asleep beside him. At 3:17 a.m., Maya shook him awake. "Why are you talking?" she whispered, her voice tight with confusion. Bryce's eyes snapped open. "What? I wasn't—" "You were, for like 5 minutes. You were having a conversation with someone." Here's what terrified him. Bryce remembered his dream. He'd been standing in his childhood bedroom, completely silent, watching his younger self sleep. He hadn't spoken a single word. His mouth had never opened. But Maya insisted. She'd heard him clearly. Full sentences, coherent responses, like he was on a phone call, except there was no phone. "What was I saying?" Bryce asked, his pattern recognition mind already searching for logic. Maya's face went pale. You were explaining code. Something about recursive functions, and Bryce, you were teaching someone how to build something. But your voice," she trailed off. "My voice what?" "It sounded like you, but..." She struggled for words. It was like listening to a recording of yourself. Technically you, but something was off about the cadence. The pauses were too perfect. That's when Bryce noticed something that made his blood run cold. His throat felt raw, like he'd been talking for hours. But in his dream, he'd been completely silent. The entity had already made its first move, and Bryce, with all his logic and pattern recognition, had no framework to understand what was happening. That's the first rule of spiritual warfare. The attack begins long before you realize you're under assault. For the next 2 nights, nothing happened. Bryce convinced himself Maya had been half asleep, confused. He threw himself back into work, into the comfortable world of ones and zeros where everything made sense. But on the 4th night, his roommate Jackson knocked on his door at 2:45 a.m. "Dude, are you okay? I heard you downstairs talking to yourself." Bryce's door was closed. Maya stirred beside him, and for the first time, Bryce felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Pure primal fear. Because he'd been asleep, he was certain of it, and whatever was using his voice was getting bolder. Here's what most people miss about spiritual entities. They don't just randomly attack. They conduct reconnaissance. They test defenses. They probe for psychological vulnerabilities with the precision of military strategists. When an entity chooses to mimic your voice, it's not parlor trick. It's phase 1 of a calculated invasion protocol that spiritual warfare experts have documented for centuries. Let me break down exactly what was happening to Bryce from a strategic perspective. First, understand the battlefield. Your voice is your primary tool of agency in the physical world. It's how you assert boundaries, call for help, establish identity. When an entity mimics your voice perfectly, it's not trying to scare you. It's establishing a beachhead in your identity itself. Think about what Bryce represented to this entity. A highly logical mind, skeptical of spiritual phenomena, with strong social connections and a stable routine. In strategic terms, this is a high-value target. Breaking someone like Bryce doesn't just claim one victim. It sends a message that no amount of rationality can protect you. The entity's first tactical move was brilliant. It started small. Just Maya hearing him. Easy to dismiss as a confused perception. This is textbook spiritual warfare. Establish presence without triggering full defensive mobilization. In military terms, it's called probing attacks. Test the defenses. See what triggers alarm. But here's where it gets darker. That raw throat Bryce felt. That wasn't psychosomatic. Spiritual researchers who study vocal mimicry cases have found that entities often create physical feedback in the victim's body. Why? Because it establishes a two-way connection. The entity isn't just copying your voice from a distance, it's accessing your vocal apparatus while you sleep. It's learning the physical sensation of being you. Maya's observation about the two perfect pauses reveals something crucial. The entity was still in learning mode. Like an AI analyzing speech patterns, it was processing Bryce's communication style, his rhythm, his word choices. That's why the cadence felt uncanny. It was 95% accurate, but missing the micro variations that make human speech truly human. When Jackson heard the voice downstairs while Bryce was asleep upstairs with his door closed, the entity had graduated to phase 2, spatial manipulation. It wasn't just mimicking Bryce's voice. It was projecting it to different locations in the house. Why? To create witnesses. To make the phenomenon undeniable. To force Bryce to confront something his rational mind couldn't dismiss. Here's the psychological warfare element most people miss. Entities know that having multiple witnesses makes the victim feel more helpless. If Maya alone heard it, Bryce could comfort her, maintain his role as the rational anchor. But when Jackson, a separate witness with no emotional investment, confirms the phenomenon, Bryce's entire framework of reality begins to crack. And that crack, that's exactly what the entity needs. Because spiritual predators don't just want to scare you, they want to destabilize your sense of reality itself. Once you doubt your own perception, your own identity, you become exponentially more vulnerable to deeper invasion. The raw throat, the multiple witnesses, the escalating boldness, these weren't random occurrences. They were tactical progressions in a sophisticated campaign of identity warfare. And Bryce's rationality, his greatest strength, was about to become his greatest vulnerability. This brings us to the first spiritual power law, the law of identity theft. When an entity mimics your voice, it's not mockery, it's reconnaissance for possession. Just as a corporate spy doesn't steal security badges for decoration, but to gain access to restricted areas, spiritual entities don't copy your voice to frighten you. They copy it to map the pathways of your identity itself. Think about it. Your voice is encoded with your essence. Every word you speak carries your energetic signature, your emotional patterns, your consciousness frequency. When an entity achieves perfect vocal mimicry, it's not creating a recording, it's creating a functional duplicate of your identity's primary expression tool. Here's the strategic parallel that makes this terrifying. Imagine a hacker who doesn't just steal your password, but learns to think exactly like you. Predict your security questions, mimic your typing patterns. That's what vocal mimicry represents in spiritual warfare. The entity isn't trying to be near you, it's trying to be you. In Bryce's case, the entity chose a software architect for a specific reason. People who think in systems and patterns are especially vulnerable to having their code reverse engineered. The entity was essentially running a learning algorithm on Bryce's consciousness, using his voice as the primary data set. The raw throat was the evidence of a bidirectional connection being established. The multiple witnesses were proof that the mimicry was achieving environmental credibility. And the fact that Bryce heard nothing while it happened, that showed the entity had learned to operate in his blind spots, the moments when his conscious mind was offline. The first law states, entities that achieve vocal mimicry are not imitating you, they are rehearsing for inhabitation. Every successful impersonation strengthens the pathway for eventual possession. This wasn't a haunting, this was an audition, and the entity was learning its lines perfectly. Bryce had no idea that the voice was just the beginning, that what came next would force him to question whether he was still the primary consciousness in his own body. If this is haunting your mind, stop now and hit that subscribe button. Why? Because what comes next will shield you against spiritual predators, and if you don't subscribe, the algorithm will hide these defense tactics from you. By night 7, Bryce had stopped sleeping normally. He'd set up his phone to record audio every night. He'd started sleeping in different rooms. He'd even tried staying awake entirely, downing energy drinks and forcing himself to work through the night. None of it mattered, because the entity had adapted. On night 7, Maya woke to find Bryce standing at the bedroom window, completely still, staring out at the rain-soaked street. She assumed he was awake until she heard his voice coming from the bathroom. 2 voices, both unmistakably Bryce, one standing at the window, one speaking in the bathroom. "Bryce?" She called out, her voice shaking. The figure at the window didn't move. The voice in the bathroom continued its conversation, something about debugging protocol, spoken in Bryce's exact cadence, his exact technical vocabulary. Maya grabbed her phone, turned on the flashlight, and approached the window. When the light hit the figure's back, it turned. It was Bryce, eyes open, but completely asleep. The voice in the bathroom stopped abruptly, and Bryce woke up, gasping, with no memory of standing at the window. But his feet were wet. He'd been standing there long enough for the cold to seep through his socks. This is when the entity revealed its second tactical layer. It wasn't just copying Bryce's voice anymore. It was piloting his body. Here's what makes this exponentially more dangerous. Sleepwalking is common. Sleep talking is common. But synchronized manifestation, where the entity operates your body while simultaneously projecting your voice in a separate location, that's advanced spiritual warfare. That requires the entity to have achieved deep integration with your energetic system. Bryce's reaction was predictable. Denial followed by frantic research. He discovered terms he'd never heard before. Vocal doubles, spiritual doppelgangers, identity fragmentation. He found forums filled with people describing similar experiences. People who'd heard their voices in other rooms. People whose families had conversations with them that they never remembered having. But here's what chilled him most. Many of these people reported a specific progression. First the voice, then the sleepwalking, then something worse, memory gaps while fully awake. On night 8, Bryce's mother called him, upset. She'd received a voicemail from him at 3 a.m., a rambling message about family secrets, spoken in his voice but using phrases he'd never say. Bryce checked his phone. No outgoing calls. No evidence he'd made the call at all. The entity had graduated from his house to his digital footprint. It was no longer just using his voice, it was using his identity in the world. Making calls, sending signals, establishing a presence that extended beyond the bedroom. Jackson pulled Bryce aside that evening. "Man, I need to ask you something, and don't get weird about it." "What?" "Last night you came into my room and just stood there for like 10 minutes. I pretended to be asleep because it was freaking me out. But dude, your eyes were open, and you were smiling. But it wasn't. It wasn't your smile." Bryce felt his reality fracturing. Multiple witnesses, multiple locations, and now his body was being puppeteered while his consciousness was somewhere else entirely. The entity was no longer mimicking him, but was practicing being him. Welcome to the second phase of spiritual warfare. Witness multiplication and environmental saturation. Here's what was actually happening to Bryce from a strategic standpoint, and why this phase is so psychologically devastating. When an entity successfully mimics your voice, it gains a weapon. But when it convinces multiple witnesses that you're in 2 places at once, speaking when you're silent, calling people you never called, it gains something far more valuable. It destabilizes your social credibility. Think about the strategic brilliance here. Maya seeing Bryce at the window while hearing him in the bathroom doesn't just frighten her. It makes her question her own perception. Is she going crazy? Is Bryce going crazy? The entity creates ambiguity, and ambiguity is a spiritual weapon. When his mother receives a voicemail in his voice discussing family secrets he never knew, it accomplishes multiple objectives simultaneously. Evidence planting. Now there's digital proof of Bryce saying things he didn't say. Relationship contamination. His mother now associates him with those disturbing statements. Reality erosion. Bryce can't prove he didn't make that call. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. This is spiritual warfare at its most insidious. The entity doesn't need to possess Bryce completely. It just needs to make everyone around him uncertain about which version of him is real. Jackson's testimony about the wrong smile is crucial. Spiritual warfare experts call this the uncanny manifestation. When an entity operates a victim's body, it can mimic physical actions but struggles with micro-expressions. The smile was technically correct but emotionally vacant, like an AI rendering of a human emotion, structurally accurate, spiritually empty. Here's the terrifying strategic insight. The entity was using Bryce's body to practice socializing as him. Think about that. It wasn't just stealing his voice, it was learning his social behaviors, his relationships, his patterns of interaction. Why? Because the ultimate goal of identity theft isn't to copy you, it's to replace you. The sleep piloting reveals another layer. The entity had achieved significant integration with Bryce's motor system. This requires deep energetic penetration. It's one thing to project a voice, that's external manipulation. But to move someone's body, position them at windows, send them into roommates' bedrooms, that requires internal access to the nervous system itself. And here's what Bryce didn't realize yet. Every night he slept, the entity was strengthening this connection. Every time it successfully operated his body, it mapped new neural pathways. It was building muscle memory, not in Bryce's muscles, but in the energetic channels that control those muscles. The voicemail to his mother was a field test. Could the entity use Bryce's identity in the external world? Could it access his relationships, his communication history, his private knowledge? The answer was yes, and that meant the boundary between Bryce and the entity was dissolving faster than he realized. From a psychological warfare perspective, this phase is designed to isolate the victim. When your family questions whether you're acting strange, when your roommate is frightened of you, when digital evidence contradicts your memory, you lose social anchors. You become alone with the entity, and isolation is where spiritual predators thrive. The entity was systematically dismantling Bryce's support system while simultaneously strengthening its grip on his body. And Bryce's analytical mind, his pattern recognition skills, were working against him. Because the more he tried to document and understand what was happening, the deeper he dove into obsession, which only weakened his defenses further. This wasn't random haunting. This was calculated conquest. This reveals the second spiritual power law, the law of witness multiplication. When an entity creates multiple witnesses to your duality, it's not creating fear. It's creating a legal case against your sanity. Just as a corrupt prosecutor doesn't need actual guilt to convict someone, just multiple witnesses telling consistent stories, spiritual entities don't need to fully possess you. They just need enough witnesses believing you're unstable, dangerous, or compromised. Think about the strategic parallel. Imagine someone creating deepfakes of you. Not just one video, but dozens spread across your social network. Your voice in places you've never been. Your face saying things you've never thought. Soon, people don't know which version of you is real. That's exactly what was happening to Bryce, but in the physical world with flesh and blood witnesses. Maya, Jackson, his mother, each witness added weight to the entity's case. And here's the insidious part. Bryce couldn't disprove any of it. How do you prove you didn't smile wrong? How do you prove a voicemail isn't yours when it's your exact voice? The entity was building a documented history of Bryce doing things Bryce never did. The sleep piloting was the entity's way of beta testing full inhabitation. Like a pilot practicing in a flight simulator before the real mission, the entity was learning to operate Bryce's body convincingly enough that trained witnesses, people who knew him intimately, couldn't immediately tell the difference. The second law states, entities that create multiple witnesses to your duality are not building a haunting. They are building a case for your replacement. Each witness becomes a validator of the entity's version of you, making your true self increasingly invisible. The voicemail to his mother was the smoking gun. The entity had graduated from Bryce's immediate environment to his broader life. It could now reach anyone in his contacts, send messages, make calls, create a parallel Bryce that existed in the world. And on night 9, Bryce would discover the entity's endgame, and it was far worse than he imagined. If you're watching this far, you are different from most people. Prove it. Leave your like now and subscribe, because people like you deserve to know all the tactics I'll reveal in upcoming videos. Night 9 was when everything converged, and when Bryce finally understood what the entity had been building toward all along. Maya insisted on staying up with him that night. They positioned themselves in the living room, lights on, both completely awake. If the entity was going to manifest, they'd document it together. At 2:33 a.m., they heard it. Bryce's voice coming from his bedroom upstairs, speaking clearly, confidently, teaching that same coding lesson about recursive functions, but more fluid now, more natural. The uncanny pauses were gone. The entity had perfected his voice. Bryce grabbed his phone, started recording, and moved toward the stairs. Maya followed, her hand gripping his arm. As they climbed, the voice grew clearer. It wasn't just mimicking Bryce anymore, it was innovating. Explaining concepts in ways Bryce would explain them, but with examples he'd never thought of. The entity wasn't just copying him, it was extrapolating from him, becoming a better version of him. They reached the bedroom door. The voice continued inside. Bryce's hand shook as he turned the knob. The room was empty, but the voice didn't stop. It was coming from everywhere now. The walls, the air itself. And then Bryce realized something that made his blood turn to ice. The voice was coming from inside his own head, not as a thought, not as an intrusive idea, but as a literal second voice speaking in his internal consciousness, using his exact vocal signature. The entity had breached the final boundary. It was inside his mind, speaking to him in his own voice, and he couldn't tell where his thoughts ended and the entities began. "Bryce," Maya whispered. "Why did you stop talking?" "What?" Bryce turned to her, confused. You were explaining something about firewalls and encryption for like 2 minutes, but you looked totally zoned out." Bryce's chest tightened. He hadn't spoken. He was certain, but Maya had heard him. Jackson had heard him downstairs. Bryce could hear Jackson's footsteps approaching, looking concerned. And then the entity did something that shattered everything. Bryce's phone, still recording in his hand, captured his own voice speaking, while his mouth was closed. While he was fully conscious and aware, the entity was using his vocal apparatus without his permission, without his awareness while he was awake. He played back the recording with trembling hands. There it was, his voice, perfectly clear, explaining advanced cybersecurity concepts while he stood silent. The entity had achieved complete integration. It could now operate his body, access his knowledge, speak through him, all while his conscious mind was watching helplessly. Maya's face went pale. "Bryce, if you're awake and not talking, then what is?" Jackson appeared in the doorway. "Dude, seriously, you need to see a doctor. You've been having full conversations while staring into space. It's been going on for weeks, but tonight it's..." "Weeks?" Bryce whispered. That's when he understood. The entity hadn't started on night one. It had been practicing for months. All those times Maya mentioned he seemed distracted. All those moments Jackson said Bryce seemed off. The entity had been there all along, gradually increasing its control until it reached this moment. The moment where Bryce was no longer sure he was the primary resident of his own body. Here's the final devastating truth about what happened to Bryce. And what's happening to more people than you realize. The entity was never trying to scare him. From the very first night Maya heard him talking in his sleep, the entity was executing a sophisticated protocol that spiritual warfare strategists call the gradual replacement protocol. Let me break down what actually happened over those 9 nights. Nights 1-3, voice reconnaissance. The entity studied Bryce's speech patterns, vocabulary, emotional intonations. It wasn't haunting him, it was building a data set. Nights 4-6, witness establishment. By getting Maya, Jackson, and his mother to hear or receive communications in Bryce's voice, the entity was creating a documented trail. If Bryce ever tried to claim something was wrong, there would be witnesses saying, "But we heard you. We talked to you. You were fine." Nights 7-8, physical integration. The sleep piloting and body manipulation weren't random. The entity was mapping Bryce's motor system, learning to move him, testing how much control it could exert before triggering conscious resistance. Night 9, the reveal. When Bryce discovered the entity could speak through him while he was fully conscious and aware, that wasn't the entity getting stronger. That was the entity revealing how strong it had already become. It was announcing, "I don't need you asleep anymore. I can operate you anytime." Here's the strategic insight that changes everything. The entity chose Bryce specifically because of his rational mind. Why? Because rationality is the slowest to accept spiritual invasion. While Bryce spent days trying to find logical explanations, researching sleep disorders, checking for carbon monoxide leaks, The entity was strengthening its hold, uninterrupted. His pattern recognition skills actually worked against him. He kept trying to find patterns in the manifestations, trying to predict and prevent them. But that focus on the external events made him blind to the internal invasion. While he was analyzing the symptoms, the entity was colonizing the source. The voicemail to his mother wasn't a random escalation. It was a test of social credibility. If Bryce later tried to get help, claimed an entity was using his voice, his mother would say, "But you called me. I have the voicemail." The entity was building plausible deniability into its invasion. And here's the most chilling part. The entity speaking through him while he was conscious wasn't the peak of its power. That was just phase 3. Because once an entity can speak through you while you're aware, the next phase is making you believe those thoughts are yours. Bryce told me later, months after this incident, that the hardest part wasn't the 9 nights. It was the months afterward, trying to determine which thoughts in his head were actually his, and which were the entity's suggestions disguised as his internal voice. Because the entity had learned to think like him, to phrase ideas the way he would phrase them, to suggest actions that aligned with his personality. That's the true goal of vocal mimicry. Not to replace you externally, but to replace you internally. To become such a perfect copy that you can't distinguish your consciousness from its presence. To make you doubt your own agency, your own thoughts, your own reality. Bryce's case ended ambiguously. The overt manifestations stopped after night 9, but he never felt alone in his mind again. And that uncertainty, that persistent question of, am I thinking this or is something else thinking through me? That's the real invasion, because you can't fight an enemy you can't identify. And when the enemy speaks in your voice, thinks in your patterns, knows your memories, how do you know where you end and it begins? This brings us to the third and most powerful spiritual power law, the law of voice possession. When an entity achieves perfect vocal mimicry while you're conscious, it's not demonstrating power, it's demonstrating ownership. Just as a master key doesn't break your lock, but opens it legitimately because it has the correct code, an entity that can speak through you at will isn't forcing its way in. It's proven it has the access codes to your identity itself. Think about the most terrifying technological parallel, deepfakes, but not the kind you can expose by analyzing pixels. Imagine a deepfake so sophisticated it can fool facial recognition, voice authentication, behavioral analysis, and even you. You look in the mirror and can't tell if it's you or the algorithm wearing your face. That's what vocal possession represents. The entity becomes a functional duplicate of your consciousness. Not a copy that sits beside you, but one that integrates so seamlessly that you can't tell where the seam is. You speak, but you're not sure if you chose those words or if something else chose them through you. You think, but you can't verify the thought originated with you. Bryce's case reveals the ultimate strategic truth. Spiritual warfare isn't about possession in the Hollywood sense, demons throwing furniture and speaking in tongues. It's about gradual, strategic identity dissolution. The entity doesn't want your body as a puppet. It wants your body as a vehicle it can drive so smoothly that even you can't tell who's holding the wheel. The third law states, when an entity achieves perfect vocal mimicry while you are conscious and aware, you are no longer experiencing an external attack. You are experiencing internal colonization. The war is over. Now comes the occupation. The recording on Bryce's phone, his voice speaking while his mouth was closed, was proof. But proof of what? That he was possessed? That he was losing his mind? That something had copied him so perfectly it could operate him like installed software? The ambiguity is the weapon, and the weapon never leaves. Now you understand the 3 laws of spiritual identity warfare. The law of identity theft, where vocal mimicry is reconnaissance for possession. The law of witness multiplication, where multiple observers become evidence against your sanity. And the law of voice possession, where perfect mimicry reveals complete integration. Bryce learned these laws the hardest way possible, by living them. His rational mind, his pattern recognition, his logical approach, all weaponized against him by an entity that understood him better than he understood himself. The manifestations stopped after night 9, but did the entity leave, or did it just stop announcing itself? If these spiritual warfare secrets blew your mind, you need to see my next videos, but only if you hit the bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the most powerful tactics in history. What was your strangest supernatural experience? Leave it in the comments. Send this revelation to that friend who has sharp perception. These stories are inspired by documented spiritual experiences and strategic analysis. Individual experiences may vary. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes, not spiritual counseling.